Senate will stay in session until we send a bill avoiding default to President Biden's desk.
Now the Senate has a chance to make that important progress a reality.
I'm running for president because I think American decline is not inevitable.
You should vote against it. It'll take me 6 months to have it totally the way it was.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. The Senate is racing right now to pass the debt limit deal approved by the House last night. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer warned against some senators pushing to change the agreement, saying there's no reason to bring this process down to the wire. Multiple Republican senators claim they will vote against the bill. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen estimates the U.S. could default as soon as Monday if the debt limit is not raised. For more on this story, Nancy Cordes and Scott McFarland join us now. Nancy is CBS News' chief White House correspondent, and Scott is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Scott, let's begin with you. You have been talking to lawmakers all day. What do you know?
It's become quite clear. Speaking with senators, it's a matter of when, not if, this debt ceiling bill passes the U.S. Senate and moves to the president for his signature, and it could happen before midnight tonight. That's the reality. There are any number of senators with objections to this who'd like to see the bill changed, but there's a realization. There's not the time nor the political bandwidth to make changes, get it back to the House, then get it to the president. That reality is sunk in, and even the biggest critics of this bill are saying as much. They know they can't amend it, even though they'd like to. Take a listen to a few Republicans and one Democrat who are seeking changes to the compromise.
Does anybody seem like they might hold this up past Monday or to Monday? Any of your colleagues who might tie this up?
It really is all dependent on whether Democrats will allow amendments. If they allow amendments, I think it'll all come together.
What do you make of the amendments to the debt ceiling?
I'm for that, and I've got one of them that's going to get scheduled unless the whole thing would blow up. So I think we got to start doing this because if we don't, we're going to have this repeat itself.
They'll announce the process at some point, and hopefully my amendment is on there. If not, I'm going to go to the floor and try to get it added in.
So what kind of changes would senators like to make, Bob? Senator Kaine, for example, the Democrat from Virginia, wants that Mountain Valley Pipeline expansion or acceleration pulled out of the debt ceiling bill, saying it impacts his state and shouldn't be in there. The other senators, including Senators Paul and Braun, from whom you just heard, want to see larger spending cuts, far more significant than included in this compromise. They'll all make their amendments, but at this point, Bob, they really are just messaging amendments, them echoing the sentiments of their constituents. They know the amendments not only won't pass, but can't pass without damaging, if not killing, the bill.
Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia getting his fingerprints over the final product in the final days of legislation. Nancy, this sounds like a refrain during the Biden administration, during these big political moments. You have been speaking to one of many top Biden advisors, including Gene Sperling, one of the president's top economic advisors. Let's hear part of that.
Of course, we expect different, a handful of senators to have major issues. But I think in the end of the day, people know that June 5th, which is Monday, is the date that we could be at risk of the first default in the history of our country. And I think that in the end, Majority Leader Schumer and I would assume Minority Leader McConnell will make sure that this vote happens.
Nancy, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, though, is saying he's going to oppose the measure. Are there any concerns inside the White House right now that this could fall apart on the Democratic side, at least in terms of the whip count?
They don't appear to be concerned, Bob, that they're not going to have the votes at the end of the day. What they've been watching with a little bit of concern are all the senators that Scott just interviewed saying that they'd like to add this to the bill, they'd like to amend that, because if even one of those amendments were to pass, then the bill would get changed and it would have to go back to the House again. And a lot of those House members who voted for the bill last night, they've gotten out of town for the weekend. And as we know, time is of the essence. But there's another concern, which is that if senators don't get a vote on their pet amendments, that any single one of them could filibuster and hold up the process. And as you have pointed out, the deadline, the X date of June 5th is fast approaching. And so it's a delicate dance. Members of the president's staff have been reaching out all day, talking to various senators, trying to urge them to just wrap this up. And it still appears that they think that is what will happen at the end of the day, sooner rather than later. But we've seen hiccups before, and so they're not taking anything for granted.
So urgency is the main argument both sides are hearing in this discussion. One of our colleagues, Major Garrett, for his program, The Takeout, here on CBS News Streaming, sat down with Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, a Republican, earlier today. Let's take a listen.
I'm still looking at it. It might be a bad deal, or it might be a choice of two bad deals. Now, we say in foreign policies that you choose the least bad option. That might be the end of the choice. But I am still actively looking at that.
So it seems, Scott, from so many senators, from those you spoke to today on Capitol Hill to Major's conversation with the Louisiana Republican, they're saying this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, but I might vote for it.
Of the criticisms we've heard, and we've heard quite a bit, Bob, over the past few weeks about this compromise or the negotiations themselves, the most spirited, potentially the most unbridled criticism came from Lindsey Graham, who's concerned about the spending levels for the military that he says are being locked in by this deal, leaving, he says, ill-equipped the war effort in Ukraine and other U.S. military priorities. Senator Cassidy seems to be echoing that there's concern about defense spending here. There is just this finite amount of leverage senators have before the final passage vote to maybe utilize their objections to try to get some type of informal agreement to revisit that later, to maybe look back at military spending levels at a future date outside of this bill, because June 5th, circled in red, metaphorically and literally, is right there. And we brought to other Republican senators this idea that maybe there still will be a parliamentary procedure employed to make changes happen, maybe force it back to the House quickly. And Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, who's very much against this bill, says, nah, this thing's likely to get voted on tonight or tomorrow. Seems like a done deal.
Nancy, we all follow the White House pool report by the minute. These are the summaries of the president's movements, his motorcade, where he is, what he's doing. An unusual one came across the wire earlier this afternoon that President Biden fell. What's the White House's latest update on the president falling down during a commencement ceremony?
What they have said to us multiple times at this point, Bob, is that he's fine. He's fine. He's fine. He's doing OK. In fact, the president himself jogged away from that fall as if to say no harm done. He was standing on the stage at the U.S. Air Force Academy's commencement. He'd actually been on stage for a couple of hours. You see him there tripping and falling down as he was walking back to his seat after shaking the hands of about 900 Air Force graduates, the class of 2023. A U.S. Air Force official, a couple members of his Secret Service rushed to help him up, and you saw him point at something on the stage. What we were told later by Ben LeBold, his communications director, is that there was a sandbag on the stage. We were able to see it on the video that he may have tripped over. He didn't answer reporters' questions about it. This is obviously not the first time that he or any other president has been seen tripping or falling on camera. That's one of the downsides of being followed by cameras everywhere you go. In the case of this president, he is 80 years old, and Republicans have sought to make his age an issue in this election. So we'll see what they have to say about it. Former President Trump, interestingly, had an opportunity to go after him about it shortly thereafter. He was speaking in Iowa, and he decided not to. He was asked about it, and he said, oh, I didn't know that happened. I hope he's okay.
That's a professional response from the former president. I always remember, Nancy, hearing about from a friend of President Biden when he tripped one time going up to the steps of Air Force One, that he went into the plane after he tripped and was unhappy and frustrated because he knew that's all the press would be talking about for a few hours. But we're moving on with the news. Nancy Cordes and Scott McFarland, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Ron DeSantis and President Donald Trump, the former president, are already trading barbs at each other on the campaign trail. We head to Iowa next for what it's all about. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. After 2 days in Iowa, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been making campaign stops in New Hampshire. And former President Trump, he's in Iowa today for a number of events. After 2 days in Iowa, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been making campaign stops in New Hampshire. And former President Trump, he's in Iowa today for a number of events. Ed O'Keefe joins us now from Des Moines, Iowa. Ed, good to have you here from the Hawkeye State. Today was the first full day where the Florida governor and Trump were trading barbs while each other were on the campaign trail. Tell us about what you're seeing out there.
Well, notably, former President Trump here in Des Moines today holding a series of much smaller, maybe more impromptu, and in some cases completely closed-door events, and traveling with a more traditional press pool like the one that the president might travel with, as Nancy was referring to earlier. Not the kind of big stadium or auditorium or racetrack-style rallies that he's known to have in the past and that he's postponed here in recent weeks due to weather. Instead, meeting with a group of conservative activists, ministers, other active Republican Party members, knowing that if you can reach the local influencers, eventually you can convince them to convince their friends and neighbors and associates to come out and caucus for you. Throughout the day, though, relentlessly attacking former Governor Ron DeSantis, or not current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. It's notable to have an actual active governor in a race, not a former president or a former governor. And he continues to go after DeSantis on how he handled COVID, his vow to totally revamp Washington over the course of 8 years, suggesting, I don't need 8 years, I just need 6 months. Ron DeSantis turns around and says, well, if it was so easy, why didn't you do it over the course of 4 years? You can see where this is headed. But what it signals is the former president is paying extra close attention to what DeSantis is up to. Why is that? Well, he described in a radio interview Tuesday night here in Iowa the emerging dynamic between him and DeSantis as a, quote, war, saying that his strategy is to go after whoever's in second place and not worry about who might be in 8th or 9th place, hoping to knock that one out, deal with the next one, and ultimately prevail.
Ed, tell us more about the details of the back and forth.
Well, we have some of this to show people. What we've noticed is the former president, again, seizing on some of the rhetorical details that DeSantis has been sharing. Well, DeSantis turns around and questions things like the former president's electability or his record over the 4 years he was president. Take a listen.
I've been watching DeSantis go out and say, I've got 8 years. It's going to be 8 years. Let me tell you something. Right there, you should vote against him. It'll take me 6 months to have it totally the way it was. We'll have it fast.
So DeSantis, again, campaigning today in New Hampshire, making 4 stops with his wife, Casey, and also not overtly talking about the former president during his scripted remarks, but brings it up sort of obliquely or indirectly and under questioning by reporters. But here's a sample of what he said.
Leadership is also not entertainment. It's not about building a brand. It's not about virtue signaling. It is about producing results for the people that you represent.
That obviously a reference to the former reality TV star. But you get a sense, Bob, of where this is headed. It's questions of style, questions of rhetoric, questions of priorities, questions of leadership ability. And while the former president may be driving it harder, DeSantis is definitely exhibiting a willingness to engage when attacked.
And I really would love your reporter's assessment from being on the ground there. You know, back in 2016, Trump didn't win Iowa. Ted Cruz wins Iowa, the Texas senator.
Nope.
So, right. So you wonder, Ed, do the DeSantis people, do the other advisors to other contenders, do they say to themselves, there is a path here against Trump with the traditional Republican coalition, evangelical voters? Is that model of Huckabee, of Santorum, of Ted Cruz, is that still a playbook being employed? And how are voters reacting to that sort of pitch?
It's definitely still a playbook or a strategy that several are going to try to run. DeSantis, first and foremost, and most expensively, because of the super PAC that's supporting him, Never Back Down, and its plans to spend tens of millions knocking on doors, already having knocked on thousands who plans to go back 4 or 5 times. Mike Pence will be here, as you know, starting next week, and basically plans to campaign for governor and try to do what Huckabee did and what Ted Cruz did as well. Tim Scott would make a play for those more traditional evangelical, socially conservative voters. His whole faith and freedom focus is something that's quite appealing. Talked to a voter a little while ago over lunch who said, look, you know, Trump, if it's him, ultimately fine. But there's a lot of stuff that's there with him that we just don't need anymore. DeSantis, yeah, he's done good stuff as Florida governor. Nikki Haley said some good things. Tim Scott, love what he's saying. So clearly they're starting to think about it. They know they've got options. They know perhaps the default option, or the if it's him, so be it option, is Trump. But if somebody else can convince enough people around here, yeah, they could very easily prevail. But of course, winning the Iowa caucus, as Ted Cruz will tell you, as Mike Huckabee will tell you, as Rick Santorum will tell you, does not mean you win the nomination. And that's where the DeSantis guys go, we have the money now, between a campaign and a super PAC, to make it into New Hampshire, to make it into South Carolina, and the dozen or so Super Tuesday states yet to come. The other guys, at least so far, haven't been able to demonstrate an ability to plan ahead that far.
Ed, when you said Pence might be running for governor, essentially, of Iowa, it reminded me of what a source told me the other day, that Pence is looking at real estate in Des Moines. I said, are you serious? They said no, but he's all but looking at real estate in Des Moines. Ed O'Keefe, on the ground in Des Moines. Yeah. Thank you. And all eyes are on the Senate now as they race to pass this debt ceiling deal. Will it hold together? We'll look next at the bill's fate, which already has opposition from both Democrats and Republicans. You're streaming America Decides.
I just have to say that the fact that this is being called a victory by some people on our side of the aisle is absolutely inaccurate.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Republican Mississippi Senator Roger Wicker on the debt ceiling agreement. Several senators on both sides of the aisle are now vowing to vote against it. Joel Payne and Michael Rishi joined us now. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Michael serves as communications director for the Committed to America Super PAC, which supports a Mike Pence 2024 presidential bid. He previously served as director of communications for then Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, and he also served former House Speaker Paul Ryan. Good to have both of you gentlemen here in our studio for America Decides. Michael, let's begin with you. We just heard from Republican Senator Roger Wicker. What's the fallout inside the Republican Party long-term, both politically and on policy?
Well, this is really when the fun starts, after the votes happen. I mean, you walked those halls as long as anybody.
I bothered you too many times.
Too many times. But House Republicans, in Ted Lasso, they say be a goldfish, have a short memory. House Republicans are not goldfish. They will remember what happened here, every slight, who voted yes, who voted no. And as the deal begins to unfold and senators try to find ways around it, and the administration tries to find little ways around it, the capital the speaker had to use to get this incredible achievement, it doesn't just replenish itself. He will have to go about doing that bit by bit in the months to come. It's the battle that Speaker Boehner and Speaker Ryan constantly fought. So in a sense, the battle is just beginning.
So the memory will linger inside the GOP. What about inside the Democratic Party, Joel? Senator Bernie Sanders and other progressives are saying no thanks to the deal. Will that alienate them with the White House in any way?
No, and you know this. There's free passes that are being given out this week, last week, and going forward. Free passes being votes that members like a Bernie Sanders or like on the House side of Pramila Jayapal have been given out to vote no against this because they understand that their constituency expects them to stand out against this. I think that's smart management by President Biden, by House Speaker McCarthy, by Senate leadership to allow their members to vote their conscience here because they know they have enough votes. They know they have enough to get to 218 in the House, which they did, and they know they're going to have enough to get this over the hump in the Senate. I think it's just a matter of getting through the amendment process, figuring out an agreement on timing. And I think the people who I talked to, I was just speaking to a Senate Democratic chief of staff today, they said they don't see any red flags about getting this passed today.
Let's turn to 2024. Michael, you are working to encourage former Vice President Mike Pence to jump in the race. We do expect him to join the field formally next Wednesday in Iowa. He has been making the argument for months that there is a path toward the nomination should he run for a traditional conservative. Where's the argument? How do you convince voters that Pence is the answer in 2024?
I think you'll see Vice President Pence run, especially in Iowa, as sort of that Reagan, classical conservative, and no one has the experience, the conservative credentials that he does to make that argument. And you know, with Iowa, you've got to reach these people 4, 5, 6, 7 times, go to their doors to really find out and discern what their vote's going to be. And Mike Pence has the kind of experience as a Midwest governor, experience in Congress to really make that case. And so I think, he doesn't have to recalibrate his positions. He doesn't have to kind of go with the wind. And I think that, voters in Iowa especially are looking for an authentic conservative candidate. Nobody can make that case better than Mike Pence.
He's not the only one who's expected to jump in next week. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who first ran back in 2016, he's likely to get in Tuesday in New Hampshire. As a Democrat assessing the GOP race, what do you make of both Pence and Christie moving toward a run?
Bigger field, bigger advantage for President Trump. I think because President Trump has such a strong grip on about, a third of that Republican electorate, I think it makes it easier for him to continue to dominate the field and to lord over the field. I do think that Governor DeSantis has hit the trail a lot more aggressive than most folks might have assumed he has. He's been kind of going directly at Trump, particularly on this back and forth about what's woke and what's not woke and whether or not that should be an issue in the Republican primary. Also, management of COVID, whether or not Governor DeSantis did that to a plumb, to the same level of Governor Cuomo in New York. I think that it's some interesting battle lines that are being drawn. I, for one, as a Democrat, I have my popcorn ready to see a really interesting back and forth. But I do think that this is the part of the primary where you have to ask yourself, what's your constituency? And I think for these new candidates that are coming to the field, what's their constituency? Chris Christie has an interesting opportunity here, but what's his constituency? That's the question.
And what's his target? Speaking of popcorn, let's take a listen to a moment from a prior debate years ago.
Marco, the thing is this. When you're president of the United States, when you're a governor of a state, the memorized 30-second speech where you talk about how great America is at the end of it doesn't solve one problem for one person.
This notion that Barack Obama doesn't know what he's doing is just not true.
There it is.
He knows exactly
there it is,
what he's
the memorized 25-second speech.
Well, that's
there
the
it is,
reason why
everybody.
this
Oh, that is an infamous moment in the Rubio world, perhaps a famous moment in the Christie world. Governor Christie, if he's on that debate stage later this summer in Milwaukee, late August, he is maybe going to take on former President Trump, but Trump might not even show up, Michael. He could decide to take on Governor DeSantis or former Vice President Pence. How do you deal with the Christie factor?
Well, you just said half the battle here, which is who actually gets up on that stage that night. And then, yeah, he's a heat-seeking missile, and I think he will make it pretty plain who his targets are. Yeah, you hope not to be one of them, but I don't think it'll be indiscriminate. I think he will have a plan. Chris Christie always has a plan, always has someone he wants to go after. But at the same time, he'll have to answer questions too about how he handled 2016, how he handled sort of being an ally of President Trump over the years. So it's not like he won't face some incoming on the back end. It's just who will on the back end try to give it to him, and then are they taking the risk that they're poking the bear? And so that'll be, to Joel's point, that'll be the time to get the popcorn and see what happens.
If it ends up being Trump, we're pretty clear about how the Democrats would run against the former president in a general election. But suppose it's one of the other contenders. How are Democrats preparing for a non-Trump world?
I think there was a time maybe a year ago where the Biden world, the apparatus around President Biden, would have been concerned or a little bit more concerned about a Ron DeSantis or even like a Nikki Haley. But because of how the issues are setting up on the Republican side, how Republicans are being forced to run to the right of MAGA on abortion, on some of these cultural issues like transgender issues, I think that sets up President Biden to run a pretty effective general election campaign against any of these Republicans. I've been teasing out a theory to a couple of my friends in Democratic politics. President Biden has shown himself to be kind of the best difficult circumstance president that we've seen in a while. He's governed in some really tough circumstances, and he can campaign, I think, in some tough circumstances because I think he's welcome at any dinner table in America. Can every Republican say that? That's the question they have to ask themselves when they're trying to figure out who their general election candidate is.
We'll have to leave it there. Joel Payne, Michael Rishi, thanks so much for swinging by. America Decides. Thank you. That does it for today. Thanks for joining us. You're streaming CBS News.